thing tonight, but a little bit better for us, I think. And I set that up as kind of a teaser, and we'll get there in just a minute. Now, when chapter 21 opens, here's what's happened. All the lost of all ages, all the demons, all the men that are lost, all the Antichrist, false prophets, Satan. When chapter 21 opens, they're all in the lake of fire. So there's no more lost. There's no more evil. There's no more of that. The whole universe, everything that you and I know of now has been destroyed. God has took care of it. God has created a new heaven, new universe, new earth, new heaven. And it is now what we're going to get into, what we would consider the eternal dwelling place of the redeemed. This is our final dwelling place. And when we talk about it, and we use the words heaven and hell, this is kind of what we're talking about, the final eternal dwelling place for us. So we're going to get there in Revelation chapter 21. Before I read this, let me just say that, actually I want to read to you a prophecy. This was about 800 years before Jesus was born. Listen to what the prophet Isaiah wrote in Isaiah 65 verse 17. This is a prophecy now. God is speaking in prophecy. For behold, I create new heavens and a new earth, and the former things will not be remembered or come to mind. That's Isaiah's prophecy 800 years before Jesus was born. He's already prophesying about the new heaven and the new earth. And so, to me, it's kind of a remarkable thing when we look at John's description in chapter 21 for us, because it's a description for us. It's beautiful. It's great, and we're going to enjoy talking about it. But it's not based on just a kind of a platonic ideal of heaven. It's not based on some metaphysical or epistemological idea or concept or something. It's based on a real reality. It's grounded in realism. It's something that is real. God originally, as you know, created earth for our permanent dwelling. It's where God wanted us to live forever. But when sin was introduced in the world, it messed it all up. And so God now, in his salvific plan from the beginning, has been working to get rid of the old that's been marred by sin and institute a brand new. And so when John is getting a vision of chapter 21, John is now seeing the culmination of God's salvific plan. I mean, God's plan involved Jesus down on the cross. It involved the church age where we give our life to Jesus. But it also involves the culmination of all things when the former, as Isaiah prophesied, the former's passed away and all things become new. And so when sin entered the world, this world became kind of what we call occupied enemy territory. You know, Satan took up power and dominion here and took over. Revelation 21 is a complete reversal of that consequence. It's everything that from Satan's entrance in Genesis 3 until now, or until in chapter 21, it's a reversal of all that. It's taking those consequences and setting them aside. And so when we look at this when it talks about the former earth, it'll say the original earth, the former earth is passed away. When he talks about that, it is a world that is characterized by sin, by crying, by death, by disease, by negative emotions. He's talking about when the former has passed away. That's what he's talking about. And then he says the new has come. And so now this is kind of what I want to tell you. This is my opinion on it. I think John, when he talks about the new heaven and the new earth, it's not so much a cosmological view for us. In other words, I don't think John is, and I think the gates, the walls, and I think all that's going to be really, really nice. But I think John is not really interested in just the landscape and the scenery of it, as much as he's interested in the new morals and the new values because it's going to be a world without the marring of sin. And so when we read through chapter 21, I think you'll get the hint that John's focus is on those kind of things. That's why he talks about a world where there's no sin, where there's no death, where there's no dying, where there's no lying, where there's no temptation, because he's focused on the moral. You and I will be in a land, in a place, in a dwelling place that's our final, permanent, eternal dwelling place, where all the morals and values are perfectly aligned with God's. We are saved by grace. It's a one-time thing. It's a justification, we call it. And you give your life to Jesus. He changes you from the inside out. And then we are sanctified. Sanctification involves us every day becoming more and more like Jesus. We're supposed to grow in Him every day. That's sanctification. And every day I'm supposed to put His mind in mine, and I'm supposed to kind of view the world as He would view it, operate the way He would operate to an extent, and try to follow the pattern of Jesus. During this time, chapter 21, you and I are going to be glorified. We're going to go from justification through sanctification, then we're going to go to glorification, and we're going to live in a new body that's been perfected, that's not going to be diseased and dying and all that. We're going to have perfected minds, which don't lie, they don't deceive, they don't get jealous, they don't experience those negative emotions. And so John's emphasis is on that, really, the emotional part of it, the moral part of it. So now that I told you that, let's look at chapter 21 and look at what John specifically says for us. Because again, it's going to begin with what we classify as heaven. And it continues the theme from chapter 20, really. But it shifts a little bit, and now the focus is on making all things new. So look at verse 1. Then I saw a new heaven and a new earth, for the first heaven and the first earth passed away. There's no longer any sea. So John has given us this first introduction. Verses 1 through 8, this is just kind of for your information, verses 1 through 8 is John's first vision of the New Jerusalem. It's his first vision of this new city. So in verses 1 through 8, he says, I looked and I saw this. This is what I saw. Then when we get to verse 9 through verse 27, he gives us a more detailed explanation of it. It's kind of like he says, man, look what I saw. And then once he explains the generalness of it, then he goes back and says, let me give you some specifics. All right, so he says, I see the new heaven, I see the new earth, because the first one, at first order of things, that with the falling of sin, the marring of sin, all that, it's gone. God he's destroyed all of that. And John said, I see a new one. Now, again, this is a series of sequential events that started back in chapter 19, and it's leading up to now. Look at how he describes verse 1. First heaven, first earth passed away. He said, I see a new one. And then he gives us a little caveat, a little disclaimer on here. He says, and there's no more sea. I don't see any more sea. Sea in the Old Testament especially are descriptions of evil nations. That's what sea represents. So John is basically saying, I see this new city. And it's not people tend to think, and we're going to get into this a little later. People tend to think that if I say heaven, let's talk about heaven. And if I were to say to you, draw a picture of heaven, people would put this kind of ethereal type thing, these clouds and these nice little gates and all that stuff. And that may be a heavenly view, but John said, I see a new city, a new Jerusalem. He's talking about a world just like you and I have. He's talking about a world that's got lakes and rivers and oceans and grass and a place where we can. He's talking about a world like this. And he said, I see a brand new earth that God has created. He said, but the thing that really strikes me about this, because think about what he's just been through. He's just saw God destroy the earth through all these plagues, and then he saw these series of world wars Battle of Armageddon. All these nations, 200 million man army coming east across the Euphrates River. And he sees all this fighting going on and all these evil kings that are aligned with Satan and all these evil empires that are persecuting Christians. And now John said, I see this new city that God has brought. There's no more evil nations. There's no more of those countries that are out to kill Christians. There's no more of those countries that are deceiving people. There's no more of that. That's why he says there's no more sea there. There's no more evil nations that are coming up. Look at verse 2. This is interesting to me. And see if you agree with this. John said, I saw the holy city, New Jerusalem. Right, so he's talking about the city coming down out of heaven from God. And so when I read that, if he says, I see a new Jerusalem and you see this coming down, then what I think he's trying to say is it's already made. It's already there. God just brings it down to us. It's already there. God's already created it. He's just going to bring it down to us. So John said, I see this new city, this holy city, and I see it coming down. Now, remember remember English grammar. The subject, the predicate, the verb, and all that stuff. The subject of this is the city. He's talking about a city. He said, I see a new heaven, a new earth, because the first ones are gone, destroyed. Verse 2, I see a holy city. He's talking about a city. That's the subject. And he says, it's called the New Jerusalem. He says, I see it coming down out of heaven from God. Then look at the description. Made ready as a bride adorned for her husband. In other words, he says that the church or the city is so beautiful. John said, really the only thing I think of is a bride. Because honestly, nothing prettier than a bride on her wedding day. You know, everybody can agree with that. And so John said, I see it when I see this city, it's what it kind of reminds me of. The pageantry of a wedding, of a bride. And so he calls it a bride. Now, the church is the bride, isn't it? I mean, the church is the bride. But here he says the city is the bride. So the city is basically the church. So why? Because, and the reason I say that is that's the only people that are here. It's only the church that are here. There's no lost. There's no evil. It's the church. But he's describing it as, I mean, it's the city. It's the literal city that he sees. But he says now the city is almost like the bride, because the only people in the city are the bride of Christ. It's my people. Look at verse 3. I heard a loud voice from the throne. Now, it's probably I think it's God speaking from the great white throne judgment. I think John's over here in God judging lost people. He says, I heard a loud voice from the throne saying, behold, the tabernacle of God is among men, and he will dwell among them, and they shall be his people, and God himself shall be among them. And he'll wipe away every tear from their eyes, and there'll no longer be any death. There'll be no longer any mourning or crying or pain. The first things have passed away. And he who sits on the throne said, behold, I am making all things new. And he said, write, for these words are faithful and true. Then he said to me, it is done. I'm the Alpha and the Omega, the beginning and the end. And I will give to the one who thirsts from the spring of the water of life without cost. He who overcomes will inherit these things, and I will be his God, and he will be my son. But for the cowardly, and the unbelieving, and the abominable, and the murderers, and the immoral persons, and the sorcerers, and idolaters, and all liars, their part will be in the lake that burns with fire and brimstone, which is the second death. And so he's given us this description now of a voice. I mean, this is his first look at heaven. I mean, it's his first look at the new city. And he's just, right off the top of his head, this is what I see. I see a new city coming down. The first one God destroyed. This new one's coming down. And it looks like it's beautiful like a bride. It's great. And then he said, and I heard a voice. And the voice came from a throne. And the voice is talking about making all things new. And this is actually, if you like statistics, this is the last of 21 times in the book of Revelation that John hears God's voice. So it's the 21st time. And he says, I hear this voice, and his voice is talking about making all things new, and this voice is talking about There's no more pain, no more death, no more dying. Then look at verse 6. He said to me, it is done. There's 3 it is dones in Scripture. The one you know of is at Calvary, Tetelestai, it's done, it's finished. There's no more work to be done. The second one is in Revelation chapter 16, verse 17. It's the completion of God's judgment on the world system. And God says, it's finished now, I've judged it. And then the third one is here. Greek word is gargion. And it means something a little bit different than at Calvary. It just means that this segment is done. Segment is finished. And so John says, I hear God from a throne, and he's talking. And the voice said to me, it's finished now. What's finished? All that former stuff. No more of that sin-cursed world. No more of that. God said it's finished. And then he's going to give us this description. Look at the description. There's positive and negative. Because here's the way I want to set this up for you. Before John shows us the description of the city, there's a choice that has to be made, basically. And he's describing it. We've already made the choice, but he's describing it for us. So look what he says. There's no more tears, no more crying. He says there's no more mourning, no more crying, no more pain. Because all those things are done away with the first heaven and earth, because they're part of the original curse. We cry, we mourn, we die because of that first curse. Well, that first curse now has been dealt with, and that first curse, along with the first earth and heaven, has been done away with. So God says to John, there's no more of that. There's no more crying and all that, because it's a whole new system that we're in. But then he presents this choice. Look at the choice that he gives. He says, he who overcomes will inherit these things. So we are overcomers and heirs. We're going to overcome and inherit. Verse 6, he gives us his name, his qualifying name, Alpha and the Omega, beginning and the end. He's God Almighty. And then here's where he kind of sets up this choice. So that's choice number 1. You choose God, this is what you get. But then look at the second choice here. Because not only is there a city of God, there's a city of Babylon. He just destroyed it. And so the choice is, mankind's choice is, for them it's a little more specific, really, language-wise. For us, it's a little more broad. But the choice is, you choose whether you want to be a citizen of the city of God or a citizen of the city of Babylon. You choose. Now our choice is pretty easy. We just have to be convicted and make a decision and say, God, I want to be part of your city. For people later in the tribulation, the millennium is a little harder. But he said, you got to make this choice. And then he starts naming the groups that won't be there. He says, but for. There's a certain group of people that make the wrong choice. The first is the cowardly. Cowardly are those who don't fear persecution from turning away from the Lord. They can't have faith. They're not steadfast. They don't have any endurance. They're devoid of faith. And so look how John links the cowardly. He says, but for the cowardly and the unbelieving and the abominable. So John takes those in and he links them together. And he says that the unbelievers, the abominable, then he's going to start kind of listing them out for us. The cowardly. And then you look at the end of that verse, and he says their part's going to be in the lake of fire. City of Babylon, that's its end. That's the wrong choice. But look at verse 5 or verse 8 again. The cowardly, the unbelieving, the abominable, then the murderers. Why does he call them murderers? Because they're guilty of the death of the saints of God. Revelation chapter 17, verse 6. Revelation chapter 18, verse 24. They killed God's saints. So God says they're murderers. Now look at the second description, the sexually immoral. When it talks about immoral persons, it's talking about sexual immorality. Fornicators. It says that they made their choice. Then he gives us a third group. He says sorcerers. Those are practitioners of magical arts. Wizards, warlocks, all that stuff. See, they made their choice. Then he says idolaters and all liars. Look what he says. Their part going to be in the lake of fire. Made their choice. So before he goes into verse 9, where he starts giving us a description of the city, he says people had a choice. They could have chose the right way, the wise way, and they could have inherited the kingdom of God, the city of God, this New Jerusalem. And I think the voice is probably coming from the great white throne of judgment anyway, and it may be what God's telling those people. You guys had a choice. You're going to now have part in the lake of fire because you made that choice. You could have had the city of God. You could have been in the New Jerusalem. In the New Jerusalem, he says, there's no death. There's no dying. There's no pain. There's none of that stuff. But he says in the lake of fire, you're going to live in a place forever that burns with fire and brimstone. It's a miserable place. But it all boils down to a choice. In other words, God is almost vindicating his own righteousness. I'm not, God's saying, I'm not capricious. I'm not arbitrary. I don't just say, you're going to heaven, you're going to hell. He said, you guys all had the same choice. Some of you chose wisely, some of you chose poorly. And now it's the end result of it. So he gets that out of the way. And then John goes into verse 9. And in verse 9, John is going to start using some parallelism. And he's going to link this back to chapter 17, verse 1 in the city of Babylon. And he's going to show the difference between the new city of Jerusalem and that old city of Babylon that's been destroyed. So it's probably in verse 9. Look at the setup. Then one of the seven angels, possibly the angel that showed him the harlot city in chapter 17, because that's why it's paralleled with chapter 17, because John said, I've already showed you the wicked city. Now I'm going to show you God's city. So he says, one of the seven angels who had the seven bowls full of the seven plagues came and spoke with me, saying, come here, and I'll show you the bride, the church, the city, the wife of the Lamb. Now, verse 10, here we go. It says, he carried me away in the spirit to a great and high mountain and showed me the holy city Jerusalem coming down out of heaven from God. So, once again, he's in the spirit on the Lord's day. God has put him in this supernatural experience so he can envision this. And he said, this angel took me up to a high mountain and showed me this city coming down. Look at verse 11. Having the glory of God, Shekinah glory of God, this overpowering, eternal, majestic, brilliant glory of God. John said, I saw this. The city was glorified like God. Her brilliance, the city's brilliance, was like a very costly stone, as a stone of crystal clear jasper. So he says, out of this new city, he says, the city is the eternal home of all believers. This is where we're going to live. It's one of the places we're going to live. And he says, it's coming down out of heaven. Then he starts describing it. And he says, the new city, and when he's talking about the glory of God and the jewels and all that, he's talking about that the city is almost ablaze with light. It's very radiant. It's very bright. It's the opposite of gloomy. It's the opposite of a lake of fire. It's very brilliant, light, beautiful. And then he talks about jasper stones. Jasper is a stone that's transparent with like fiery burst of red in it. And John said, that's the image that I saw. This city was coming down. It was this magnificent color. And John said, it reminds me of a jasper stone. So now, in verse 12, he starts to give us the description. This is where you're going to live one day. Verse 12, it had a great and high wall with 12 gates, and at the gates 12 angels, and names were written on them, which are the names of the 12 tribes of the sons of Israel. There were 3 gates on the east, 3 on the north, 3 on the south, and 3 on the west. And the wall of the city had 12 foundation stones, and on them were the 12 names of the 12 apostles of the Lamb. The one who spoke with me had a gold measuring rod to measure the city and its gates and its walls. All right, so first off, he talks about the wall. It's a real wall, I think. I think it's a real wall. I think John said, I see the city and there's a wall. But I think symbolically and spiritually, the wall symbolizes that my works can't get me in there. John said, I see this new city. All the believers are going to be living in here. But it's walled off. You can't work your way into it. It's spiritually attained. You can't, there's no amount of works that you can do to gain interest into the city. It's kind of like the Noah's Ark. You know the story of Noah's Ark. God said Noah build the ark. Noah built the ark. God sent the animals. Noah got them on the ark. And then what does the Bible say about it? God shut the door. And as much as Noah may have wanted to open the door for the rest of the people that were drowning, he couldn't because God shut it. It was God's plan. You couldn't get in that ark. They already had their chance. They missed it. This is the same thing. It's a real wall, I think, but I think it symbolizes for us. Now I think we can spiritualize this to say that God's city, this holy city, this New Jerusalem, can only be accessed through faith, not works. You can't work your way into it. And so he tells us about this wall. In other words, the access to the city is entirely based on a spiritual transformation. I have to be spiritually changed to get in here. All right, so then he tells us about the gates. 12 gates and an angel at each gate. The angel kind of, I guess, is kind of like an honor guard at each gate. And each name, there's 12 gates, so on each gate is the name of one of the 12 tribes of Israel. They're inscribed somehow. Verse 21, if you go down to verse 21, the 12 gates were 12 pearls. So he tells us that they were made of pearl. So it says there's this wall around the city, and in the wall are built 12 gates. There's 3 on the north, 3 on the east, 3 on the west, 3 on the south. He said each one of these 12 gates has a name written on it. I don't know how they're written on it, but they have an inscription of a tribe of Israel, and it probably I don't know which 12 it is. But he says on each one of those gates sits an angel. And the angel kind of functions like an honor guard there. So when I say this, I'm not telling you this because it'd make a great scene in a movie or something. I'm telling you that because you and I are going to be living here. It's what we're going to be seeing. This is what we're going to be strolling around and looking at these gates and these walls. And these gates, he says, are made of pearl. And we're going to be looking at these things. This is our home that I'm describing to you. So it's not just kind of pie in the sky stuff. Look at verse, let's go back to verse, I want to skip down because I want to come back and end with the measurements. Look at verse 18. The material of the wall was jasper, and the city was pure gold like clear glass. So what does that tell you? It's transparent. John can see through it. You can see through it, but you can't access it. You can't get there unless you're spiritually transformed. You can see through it. So John said, I see this wall, and it's transparent enough I can see through it. Look at verse 17. And you tell me what he means. He measured its wall 72 yards according to human measurements, which are also angelic measurements. I don't know why I had to tell us that angels measure the same way we do, but as we said, it's the same in human measurement and in angelic measurement. But he says it's 72 yards. It's 216 feet. Right? But notice what he doesn't say. He doesn't tell us if that's a height or a width or a depth. He doesn't tell us what the measurement is. I don't know if it's 216 feet thick. I don't know if it's 216 feet high. He really don't say. He just says it measures 72 yards. So there again, I guess you can make that up for yourself. You know, whether you think it's 216 feet high or 216 feet wide or however you want to look at it. But that's what he says. Look at verse 14. And the wall of the city, a wall that has those 12 gates, has 12 foundation stones. And on them were the 12 names of the 12 apostles. So he says there's 12 gates. Each one of those are inscribed with the name of a tribe of Israel. There's an angel on top. And then he says that in verse 14, there's 12 foundation stones. And on them were written the names of the 12 apostles. On those foundation stones. On the top of those stones. And we're going to talk more about these stones a little bit later, maybe next week. But that's how he's describing this. It is, there's a 216-foot wall, however it's measured. He says the wall has 12 gates, 3, 3, 3, and 3. On each one sits an angel that's kind of like an honor guard thing. Each one of them has the description of a tribe of Israel. And then around the wall are 12 foundation stones in the wall. And on top of the stones are written the name of the 12 apostles. So you can determine whether it's Matthias or Paul on the 12th one. You can choose. But he says that's what it looked like to me. When I saw this new city coming down, I saw the angel delivering this city. He said that's what it looked like. A wall with 12 gates, 12 stones. And I saw these names and this beautiful transparent color with this fiery red in it. John said that's what I got out of it. Now look at verse 15. Because verse 15, his attention is drawn to the city. All right, now he's going to talk about the actual city. Here's where we're going to extrapolate a little bit, and maybe we'll get a little bit excited here. But look at verse 15. The one who spoke with me had a gold measuring rod to measure the city and its gates and its wall. The city is laid out as a square, and its length is as great as its width. It's a perfect square. And he measured the city with a rod 1,500 miles. Its length and its width and its height are equal. So he said, I see a perfect square where it's the length is 1,500 miles, the height is 1,500 miles. If you think about the 1,500 miles, think about this. It's 1,500 miles high, it's 1,500 miles wide, it's 1,500 miles long. So you think about this. It would stretch from Canada to the Gulf of Mexico. All right? So the height of from Canada down to the Gulf of Mexico. Then it would go from the Atlantic Ocean over here in the east all the way over to Colorado. So from Canada down to the Gulf of Mexico, from the Atlantic Ocean all the way to Colorado. That's what John sees. And the language of it, the height, the width, the depth, and represents a cube. It's like a box, like a cube. And he says 1,500 by 1,500 by 1,500. If you took 1,500 buildings, each one of them a mile high. All right, so you have 1,500 buildings, each building 1 mile high. Those buildings would cover those dimensions from the Atlantic Ocean to Colorado, from Canada down to the Gulf of Mexico. So you got 1,500 buildings a mile high. That's kind of what he's describing here. All right, so now watch this. If each building, let's say, is a mile high, let's say it's 100-foot high, and it has 10 stories in it, then you could get 52.8 of them inside every mile-high building. So if you got a mile-high building, a 1,500-mile-high building, all right, you get 52.8 of them. 79,000, and this is going to make a little bit more sense to you in just a minute. 79,000 10-story buildings, each with the same dimension inside each one of them. So you do the math, 1,500 by 1,500 by 1,500, and this is what you get. And you can check my math if you want to. But if you do the math on it, the size of the city, John said he measured the city. So if you measure the city, it is 49 sextillion, 553 quintillion, 856 quadrillion square foot of living space. So John said when he measured this city, it's 49 sextillion, 553 quintillion, 856 quadrillion square foot of living space. All right, talking about a big place. Let's say, here's where we're going to kind of speculate. Let's say there's 20 billion believers from the history of mankind. Whether or not that's high or low, the math works for me. So we use 20 billion, say there's 20 billion believers. And let's say out of that 49 sextillion space, let's say 75% of it is for public use, because this is a city. Let's say 75% of it is parks and beaches and golf courses or whatever. 75% of it is public use. All right, and it's that big. Let's say there's 20 billion believers. Then watch this. Then it gives you 25% for private living spaces. All right, so if there's 75% for public use and 25% for private dwelling, there's a cube. It's a heaven and an earth. There's a new heaven and a new earth. And so that means that each believer, if there's 20 billion believers, there could be less. So it would increase it. But if there's 20 billion believers, then each believer will have 1/30th of a cubic mile for their own space, or 75 acres on 6 faces, because it's a cube, which means that you will have, as an individual, God is preparing this place for you. If you assume it's that big because the angel measured it, and if you assume there's 20 billion believers, then you're going to have 75 acres on your own, on 6 faces, which means that you and I will be able to live up, down, diagonal, sideways. We'll be able to go, I think, like Jesus did. I think you and I will be able to go between the new heaven and the new earth at will, just like Jesus did. Because he says we'll be just like him. And so that's fun. I don't know if that's the way it's actually going to be, but for me it's fun to think about it, because I think I've never owned 75 acres. That'd be pretty cool. You know, have a lot of room to move around. But we can live across those 6 faces. I don't think our heavenly bodies are going to be limited like they are now. The Bible says we're going to be, it says, John said, I don't know what our bodies will be like. I don't know what we'll be like when we get there. But he said, we'll be like Jesus. So what do we know about Jesus after he was resurrected and he came back? He ate. He was hungry. He ate fish with his disciples on the beach. He walked through locked doors. He just appeared inside the upper room. He went from heaven to earth kind of at will. Just went back and forth. Because heaven is where God dwells. Heaven is our eternal home, but it's in almost like in 2 parts, because there's a new city that we have, or a new earth that we have, new city, New Jerusalem. And so we'll be able to live between them, however we want to live. All right. Any questions about that? Any of y'all think I'm a nut? Yeah, I like thinking about kind of bizarre things, you know, that because I hope it turns out to be true. All right, look at verse 19 and 20. And we'll close talking about these stones one last time. The foundation stones of the city wall were adorned with every kind of precious stone. All right, so these are those foundation stones. There's 12 of them. The first foundation stone was jasper. Jasper, again, is crystal clear. Sometimes it's got this fiery red, transparent in the crystal. So imagine the foundation stone of the wall. One of those stones is crystal clear, and it's got this fiery red inside. He says, the second was a sapphire. You know what a sapphire is? It's blue. It's deep blue. It's like a diamond in hardness, but it's deep blue. So one of the stones is transparent with this fiery red inside. One of the stones is a sapphire, deep blue. The third is a chalcedony, sky blue. It's kind of a sky blue, and it's got little stripes of other colors inside the sky blue. So one of those stones is going to be a kind of a sky blue color. It's going to have other stripes of different colors inside it. Then the fourth is an emerald. You know what an emerald is? Bright green. The fifth is a sardonyx. It's red and white mix. It's just a red and white mix stone. The sixth is a sardius stone. That's red. That's I would say Georgia Bulldog red. Make me feel at home there. The seventh is a chrysolite. A chrysolite is it's like an amber color. It's like a transparent gold color. A chrysolite stone. So remember, these are the foundations of this wall. The 12 stones. These are the 12 stones. The eighth is a beryl. A beryl is sea green, kind of a sea green color. The ninth is a topaz. It's kind of a transparent yellowish green, whatever that is. The 10th is a chrysoprase, which is a kind of like a Kelly green color. The 11th is I guess in Latin, a jacinth. It's a violet, kind of a violet color. And then the 12th is an amethyst. It's purple. So get those colors in your head, because the wall around the city, and it's massive city, it's 1,500 by 1,500 by 1,500. And he says, there's a wall around it. And he says the wall around it has 12 foundations. So it's spaced out around the wall are these foundation stones, and they're those colors. Crystal clear with red, blue, sky blue, bright green, red and white mix, transparent gold, all these different colors. So it's going to be a very colorful, very heavenly place. Very, very beautiful place. Look at verse 18. The material of the wall was jasper. The city was pure gold, like pure glass, or like clear glass. So the city is like the wall. It's gold-like transparent glass, because everything in the New Jerusalem is undefiled. It's pure. It's transparent. Verse 19, the foundation stones of the city skip down to verse 21. And the 12 gates were 12 pearls. Each one of the gates was a single pearl. And the street of the city was pure gold, like transparent glass. It's what theologians sometimes call the Great Street. And notice that. And in Greek, it really is singular. We always talk about walking the streets of gold. There's one street. And he says this street is like pure gold. It's like glass, the street itself. Because again, everything is pure. It's undefiled in the new heaven and new earth. So he says, he sees this street that's there. In chapter 22, he's going to tell us what's on each side of the street. Verse 22, I saw no temple in it. Oh, that's strange, because God's always had a temple, but there's no temple because a temple in Greek, it's a naos. It's the dwelling place of God. This whole city is the dwelling place of God. There's no need for a temple because God continually dwells there. This presence of God. Verse 22, the city had no need of the sun or the moon to shine on it, for the glory of the God has illumined it, and its lamp is the Lamb. So there's no sun, no moon. God is the light. Jesus is the light. The glory of God will light the whole place. James, the brother of Jesus, in chapter 1, verse 17 of James, he basically says the same thing. There's no need there. You get verse 24, or 24, yeah. The nations will walk by its light. Remember, there's no evil nations. The kings of the earth will bring their glory into it. In the daytime, for there will be no night there. Its gates will never be closed, and they will bring the glory and the honor of the nations into it. And nothing unclean and no one who practices abomination and lying shall ever come into it, but only those whose names are written in the Lamb's book of life. Look at how he describes this for us. Look at look at what he talks about. Eternity for you and I. People talk about what we're going to be doing in heaven. Well, it's going to be constant activity. It's a dynamic existence. We're going to be doing things. We're going to be living our life. It's just not going to be sin-filled life. But look at how he describes this. The kings of the nations will come before him. They'll bring things to him. Just look at the way it describes it. The nations will walk by its light. The kings will bring their glory into it in the daytime, because there'll be no night. Gates won't be closed. They will bring the glory and the honor of the nations into it. You know what he's talking about there? He's talking about that throughout all eternity, especially, you and I will be involved in it too, but world leaders will form a procession to those gates to honor the Lord. Here's what he's talking about: constant worship. He's talking about constant worship. He's talking about, like, right now, when you and I drive in a car, we're listening to Christian music, or when we're at a church service and choir singing, a preacher's preaching, Sunday school teacher's teaching, sometimes we have these real worshipful moments, especially in the car, singing to yourself. You sometimes you kind of get carried away and you think, well, I hope nobody saw me because I was really getting into this song, kind of thing, and it's the music kind of overcomes you, it just, and I always kind of describe it like, if I'm watching a really good movie and I'm really into this movie, and then there's a soundtrack that accompanies the movie, and there's music that's just playing in the background. The characters are doing things, and this music's playing in the background. Even if it's has a negative thing, like Jaws, for example. You sit there, you watch Jaws, and this poor lady swimming out in the ocean, and all of a sudden you hear that music, dun dun dun, and you're not really consciously thinking about the music. I mean, you hear it, and it's part of it. You're not thinking about it. It just becomes ingrained into the movie. And so as you're watching the movie, the soundtrack's just kind of in the background, but it enhances the movie experience for you. Because I don't think the shark would be nearly as terrifying without the dun-dun, dun-dun. It'd just be a movie. And so you're watching a movie, and it's a really good movie, but then they pump that soundtrack in there. And sometimes a soundtrack in movies makes me tear up. Sometimes it chokes me up, and I think, boy, this is powerful. That music's got me, I think that's what he's talking about in heaven. I think in heaven it's not going to be a conscious thing where we come to church one Sunday morning, we get out our Bibles, and we start hearing somebody speak. I think heaven is going to be a constant worship experience where the overall atmosphere of heaven is just worship. And so we're doing things. I think we'll work in heaven. I think we'll just be doing things that we enjoy. I think we'll be having friendships in heaven. I think they'll just be pure and not defiled by anything. But I think as we're doing things in our eternity, worship is going to always be in the background of it. And so if I'm playing golf, it'll be surrounded by a worshipful attitude, and not the attitude where I want to throw my club in the lake. It's going to be worshipful. If we're working, it's going to be just a worshipful attitude. If we're just talking to Peter and Paul, it's just going to be a worshipful attitude that just permeates everything, and it surrounds us in heaven. We don't think about it, but it makes the experience better. And so John says, when I saw the city, I was impressed at this constant parade of leaders and nations that are continually coming before God, praising Him. And John's saying, I see some constant worship here. There's constant worship going on because we're in heaven. In verse 27, last thing, he gives us a division. Nothing unclean, no one whose practices abominations, no one who lies shall ever come into it. In other words, only the saved, only the saved, only the redeemed. And so you think on the one hand, all right, God is offering us a choice now. And He says, you choose me and you get this. You get to go to a place where it's constant worship, where there's no sin, there's no dying, there's no death, there's no distraction, there's none of this stuff. It's a perfect place. I'll be there. No sun, no moon. My son will light the place. You know, there's no temple there because I constantly dwell with you in this whole attitude of worship. You choose me, you get this. And then he said, but if you don't choose me, the contrast is the lake of fire. And he says the lake of fire, that's where all the lost are. That's where Satan is. That's where the Antichrist is. And he says, that's not a good experience because that's a burning place. That's a destructive place. That's a place where the Bible says the worm never dies. That it's constant turmoil, it's constant pain, it's constant misery. And I think, and I don't know, I've never suffered through it before, but I think to me, the worst part about hell to me would be never again hearing God's voice, never sensing God. Because I think now if I walk away from Him, if I get backslidden, God speaks to me and I hear Him. And He draws me back to Himself. If there's lost people that are running around there in the world, God's Spirit speaks to them. They're convicted. Christians are here on this planet, and Christians, our job is to witness to them, to share with them. And so they hear about God. They know. There's very few lost people in this world that's never heard the name Jesus. There's very few of them. They know. And God pulls at their heart. I know when I was 9 and God started convicting me, I was sitting in church thinking, well, I really need to go up front, but I'm scared to do it. So I was holding on to the pew for dear life. You know, I'm like, I'm not doing this. You know, I'm scared. I don't know what to do. And so we got home, and I told Mom and Daddy, this is what I'm feeling. And so they took me to the preacher's house, and he knelt with me in front of his couch and led me to the Lord. And I remember thinking, what a tremendous pull that was for me. I mean, God was really, really working on my life. He was really telling me that I needed to change. You know, I was 9. I wasn't involved in a lot of stuff, but I knew I needed the Lord. I knew I needed Him. And so God pulled me to Himself. In hell, there's none of that. In hell, those people are totally separated from God forever. There's no more still small voice. There's no more conviction. There's no more God's compassion and God's mercy. It's just misery. It's eternal separation from God. Christians, saved people, are in a state of eternal worship. Lost people are in a state of eternal separation. There's no God there. There's no hearing from Him there. He cuts you off. To me, that's worse. To me, that's bad. So that's what John tells us about the new heaven and the new earth. We have one more week. Chapter 22, we'll wrap it up. He kind of continues the description for us of the New Jerusalem, tells us what's on the side of the street and all that. And then starting week after next, we're going to start going through Ezekiel. And we'll look at the prophecies in Ezekiel because they tie into these in some ways. Any questions before we cut this off? All right. Thank you guys for joining us. If you're watching us online, we appreciate you being with us, and we really, really want you to come see us Sunday or come back and be with us Wednesday night.